Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today, we are sitting down with my friend Molly Baskette, who recently wrote an amazing book called How to Begin When Your World is Ending. And so, Molly, welcome to the podcast. I'm excited to have this chat with you.
Thank you. So great to meet you and excited to be here.
Thank you. So, first things first, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself. We'll get into your story in a little bit, obviously, but for now, give us the quick kind of rundown about yourself and a little bit about what you do.
You bet. I'm a pastor. I've been a pastor for, gosh, if you count student ministry years, about 30 years,
A
lifelong
lifetime, right?
Christian. Yeah, it feels like several lifetimes, actually,
Right.
especially right now.
Yes.
Um, been a Christian my whole life, actually cradle UCC, which I'm
Mhm.
realizing is fairly rare. A lot of people migrate into the UCC, United
Yep.
Church of Christ. We're a big tent, but I started going to a little church called Broadview Community in Hartford, Connecticut when I was 4 years old.
Mhm.
And the church bug, as well as the God bug, bit me. They're not the same, they're a little different. And I stayed bitten pretty much my whole life, or except for about 3 weeks in college when I took a religions of China class and decided I was an atheist Taoist and was heartbroken about it. And then I realized, well, wait, I can be a Taoist and a Christian and challenge God and have days where I don't believe in God, but
Mm,
still let myself be enfolded by a sense of wonder.
mm,
Um, I'm a mom. My
mhm,
kids are 16 and 20. We're in a really blessed moment where they are both living at home, but kind of working on themselves and,
mhm.
and their own flourishing. Married to a guy I met in seminary. I like to say that he went to seminary to find a spouse. Um, he grew up in California where we live now, so I dragged him back east where I grew up for a number of years, and we moved to the Bay Area where I pastor a UCC in Berkeley, California. We moved here about 6 years ago, and my church burned down on my 5 month anniversary. And a
Wow.
month later, Trump was elected, which my people took very personally, and
Wow.
lots of other things happened. So I did what I do. I write the books that I need, and so I wrote a book about those horrible things that happen and lots of other horrible things along the way, hopefully with a little bit of humor.
Yeah, well, you definitely have humor peppered throughout the book, which I appreciate because it's a very serious topic. And so
It sure
it
is.
could just be very the whole book could just be very serious, but you peppered in a lot of humor in there, which I appreciated because I laughed. I feel like we have the
Yes,
same
I'm
kind of humor.
glad. Good, good. I'm so glad. I've sat at way too many, clergy luncheons and, where people just, it's like the veil of tears. It's like,
Uh-huh.
a parade of woes. And we need humor. We need the way humor um, actually helps us grieve, I think, in
Yeah.
important ways, and also, lets us laugh at the devil. I mean that
Yeah.
metaphorically and maybe actually kind of actually too.
Yeah.
When we can laugh at what wants to destroy us, it really steals its power
Yeah.
over us.
Yeah. That sounds like a good book title or maybe a podcast title, Laughing at the Devil.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Uh-huh.
So you identify yourself as a progressive Christian pastor. I've heard you
That's
say that in
right.
the book. I've seen it online in different places, but talk to us about that phrase because I feel like that's a loaded phrase. You've got progressive in there,
It
you've got
is.
Christian in
Yeah.
there, and you've got
Yeah.
pastor in there, which brings up a whole lot of things for people. So if you had to narrow it down for yourself, like what does progressive Christian pastor mean for Molly? Talk to us about that.
Absolutely. I know it sounds like a paradox. And I know particularly when it comes to selling books, it's like we people who live in this progressive Christian space lose a lot of audience because
Mhm.
they're the progressives who think, ew, you're Christian. That means you're a homophobe. It means
Yep.
you're a white nationalist. It means, or it means you're just anti-intellectual, right? And then on the Christian side of things, you say you're progressive, and people are like, oh, you're woke, or,
Yeah.
they have all kinds of preconceptions and misconceptions about that.
Yeah.
And then pastor just shuts the whole conversation down. When I
Right.
when I lived on the East Coast, actually, I joke that like where I lived in and I grew up in Boston and
Mhm.
my previous church was in Metro Boston, really, like in the Bermuda Triangle of Harvard, MIT, and Tufts. So like very intellectual. People loved
Mm.
when they found out I was a pastor, they were very curious because for the most part they weren't religious anymore, the younger people, but they had like wounds that they wanted to heal. And so they loved talking to a pastor.
Mm.
On the West Coast, forget it. It's like I don't know if that California is really like 20 years ahead of culture or just a different animal altogether. I guess we'll find out in 20 years, but people
Yeah.
find out I'm a pastor and it shuts the conversation down.
Mm,
So to dial back into your question, to me, being a progressive Christian pastor, no, is really just about understanding that God is still revealing herself.
mm,
And I use her intentionally to put a thumb on the scale of patriarchy. I don't
mm.
think God has any one gender. In the UCC, more than the cross, we use the comma as our symbol because
Mm,
we use Gracie Allen's quote that never put a period where God has put a comma. God is still speaking,
mm,
and that's not like a 21st century catchphrase. It's been part of our theology since the very beginning. We
mm,
understand that God is still revealing themselves to us. God is still showing us where we've gotten it wrong, where we've gotten God wrong, or we've maybe attributed to God all of our prejudices and biases and blind spots.
mm,
Um, and so I just try to stay open and inclusive. And I know this sounds trite, at least if you live in progressive Christian circles, but a colleague of mine who's in a sort of garden variety UCC, I won't say where, one of that pastor's parishioners recently took issue with the idea of radical inclusivity. Like
mm.
we should have moderate inclusivity, right? Like none of this radical inclusivity. And to me, radical inclusivity just means everybody's welcome.
Yeah,
Like true, everybody's welcome. Not all behaviors are welcome, but all people are welcome.
yeah.
And particularly those who have been scapegoated, marginalized, used, um, killed literally, and theologically and metaphorically,
Mm,
um, by the heresies of racism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia.
mm,
So, progressive Christianity is trying to build a big tent. It's saying, um, you know, you are loved just as God made you, and as you're still
mhm.
becoming. Um, and because you have been so well loved, the more you perceive that love, the more you offer it to others,
Yeah.
including people you maybe have previously understood to be outside of the realm of God's kingdom.
Yeah, I love that because I grew up in a world where it was the opposite. It was we say everybody's welcome. We put signs on our buildings that say everybody's welcome, but what goes on inside the building sings a much different tune. Like I pastored a reformed church for a long time, way back in the day. And how I fit in a reformed
Yeah.
church, I don't know, but it worked for that season of my life. But we had
Mhm.
conversations about like I remember being confronted with, what are you going to do if a gay couple comes to church, like on a communion Sunday? And I'm like, I don't know, like give them something to eat, like Jesus would do, like let them come to the
Amen.
table. But that's the
Yeah.
wrong answer. The right answer was no, you don't let them come to the table until they repent. And I'm like, I don't see the how that connects with Jesus. Like even back then, like my thoughts about LGBTQ people were not as evolved as they are now. But even at that stage in my life, I was like,
Didn't make sense.
I just
Yeah.
don't see how that works. And so to
Same.
hear somebody like yourself, who's a pastor, doing that kind of work brings so much joy to my heart because it's just the opposite of what I came up in.
Yeah. I mean, I can say I don't understand it because I didn't grow up with it, but I feel like I wouldn't understand it anyhow. Like
Yeah.
you look at the community that Jesus surrounded himself with, you look at how he interacted with people from such a wide variety
Hmm.
of settings and walks of life. And then Paul after him, and I have my issues with Paul. He could be a real curmudgeon. He could be very like binary himself and
Yeah.
exclusive, but and Peter too as well. It's like there's so many different kinds of people who were attracted to Jesus' message, and Jesus found a place for all of them,
That's right.
and gave all kinds of people authority, and subverted the authorities of his day. So like that whole like idea of power from below and power from the margins, and
Yeah.
it's way more fun to pastor a church like that or be part of a church like that. Just
That's right.
we call ourselves one of our trans members actually coined the phrase the motley pew, and that's it's been sort of become our
I
catchphrase
love
as
it.
church. And to me that's when I feel like I'm in heaven on earth, when
Yeah.
we're just a really ridiculous group of people who don't fit together, like who in
Yeah.
any other room we would never find ourselves in any other room than this
Yeah.
one.
Yeah, that's so good. So let's talk about your book. I love your book. Like I said to you before, and I think in our email exchange, I said this is one of the best books I think I've read really in a long time because it's like I said, it's so
Thank
real.
you,
There's so many good
Glenn.
stories in there. Yeah, and it was just so encouraging to me, just in my own season of life that I'm in. But maybe before we get into like the meat of the book, give us like an overview of what this is
Sure.
about. Like if someone elevator pitch it, if somebody is to go to Amazon and buy it, what can they expect, and who is kind of like your target audience that you're writing to?
Well, the wonderful millennial I hired to teach me how to do Instagram, and I'm unteachable. I'm still terrible at Instagram. Would be mad at me for saying this, but it's for everybody. Like
Yeah,
it's
right.
for anyone who's lived through anything.
Hmm.
Even if you're doing better right now, it will hopefully give you some solace, comfort, wisdom. Not wisdom from me, but that, I'm a magpie that I've gathered from people through the
Yeah,
years
yeah.
for whatever you're going to go through next.
Yeah. I think that's really good because looking at the title, it's called How to Begin When Your World is Ending, Spiritual Field Guide for Joy to Joy Despite Everything. You could look at that and say, well, my life isn't really ending right now. I feel pretty good about everything. But as I was reading the book, there were so many things that I was thinking back over my life and some of the things that I've healed from, that I've made it past, I've made it through, but then going back saying, oh, like it helped me look at it through a different lens, which I felt like brought a deeper layer of healing because I was like, I thought I was over this thing, but I read something that you wrote or somebody else's story in the book, and I'm like, oh, like that just awakened a whole bunch of stuff in me that I thought I dealt with, but I didn't really deal with. But now it's helping me see it in different light. So for our listeners, even if you don't feel like your world is falling apart, this book is still for you.
Thank you, Glenn. That's maybe the nicest thing you could say about my book. I really love hearing that. I
Oh,
love hearing that I tore all your old wounds open again.
nice. Tore all the scabs off. I'm bleeding all over
Woo!
the room here.
Maybe that do my elevator pitch.
Right.
Tearing scabs off one story at a time.
That's right. So, take us into your story a little bit. Obviously, the book is your story, so we don't want to give everything away, but take us into it a little bit because, like I said, I mean, this book is not your typical book where it's filled with theories, it's filled with deep, in depth research, but the book comes from a very personal place in your life and then also the personal places of other people's lives whose stories you're able to share. So take us into whatever spaces of the stories that you'd like to take us into, and maybe we'll just see what kind of rabbit holes we travel down together.
Sounds good. So it started as a cancer blog. They found a cancer in me, a very aggressive cancer that teenage boys usually get. I was 39 years old. My
Mm,
kids were 4 and 8 at the time. I was asymptomatic. The way they found it, I'll leave that story in the book, but
mhm,
was entirely mystical and incredible. And it's the
mm,
reason I'm alive today. Um, and I blog my way through that again. I write the things I need, and writing
mm,
is my way of kind of swimming to the surface of whenever I feel like I'm drowning, making meaning, if not sense, of what's happening. And I always thought I'd sort of make that a story with a beginning, middle, and end once I
mhm.
was through it, if I got to live. And spoiler alert, I did. But then as I was writing, with help from early readers, I realized this is not really just my story. It's about all the resurrections, all the, Father Richard Rohr is a huge influence on my thinking.
Mhm.
We die and resurrect hundreds of times in our life. Like maybe like if we're really tuned in spiritually a few times a day, right?
Yeah.
And I've been privileged to walk with so many other people through their own resurrections in life that I really wanted to just tell their stories, hopefully in a really illuminating way, but also do like a little reverse engineering on where God, how God was present, how I or they were able to accept the gifts of God in the moment,
Mhm,
by reaching out, asking for support, stating our needs, sometimes like often in really vulnerable ways,
mhm,
breaking patterns, um, to kind of be co-collaborators with God in our own resurrections. And that's what it is. So the
mhm,
story, as the book as a whole, is my cancer arc, and really in lots of ways my parenting arc, because our older child has been, describe him as my best spiritual teacher. He has ADD and has some trauma himself,
mhm,
and I was not always the parent I wanted to be with him, and you know there's like all these tender moments in the last 5 or 6 years of parenting him through late adolescence and his own struggles that, um, writing my way through it, it was very revealing and brought us a lot closer and brought a lot of healing to our relationship.
Mm,
And then pepper through with these other stories, and also some of the really terrible or just banal theologies out there, like God has a plan, all the stupid things well-meaning, loving people say to us when they don't know what to say, when
yeah.
we are facing our own diagnosis or going through a divorce or suffering with treatment resistant depression or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Because we say those things to make ourselves feel better, but they really can actually do a lot of harm. So I unpack some of those phrases or concepts and reach for a theology that's still evolving, but maybe matches up more with what real life is really like.
Yeah. Yeah. So what was one of the harder phrases that you had to unpack, like that you were confronted with when you received this cancer diagnosis? What, what aspect of your faith, or what like rote phrase that we often tell people when those kind of things cross their plate? Like, what was the one thing that you really had to confront and deal with and kind of dig into
Sure.
to come through this?
Oh, for sure it was, God never gives us any more than we can handle,
Oh yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
because strength was kind of my brand.
Hmm.
I talk about this early in the book. I was raised poor, particularly living with my mom,
Hmm.
welfare, food stamps, Section 8 housing. There was a lot of neglect and substance use disorder in my
Hmm.
family that meant I was kind of on my own a lot. And it's so when I think about a few things that happened in my childhood, it's kind of a miracle I'm still here. And so, like, while I paid a lot of lip service to interdependence and
Hmm.
vulnerability before even writing this book or before getting cancer, um, at my core, I was like, I really felt alone
Yeah.
into probably my late 20s until,
Mm,
falling in love with my husband really taught me that I needed to let other people in more and like
mm,
have the courage to be truly vulnerable. Vulnerable meaning open yourself to being wounded by someone who
yeah.
says they love you, which in any long-term relationship is going to happen.
Mm,
Um, so getting cancer helped me to kind of do that work at the next level, to let go of my workaholism because I couldn't work. I was so sick and my brain was so foggy and I really could, it was like keep yourself alive and then do part of the work to keep your kids alive. My kids were
yeah.
still small and they really needed me. Um, and let people in, like, figure out who and how to let all the people who love me in at the right level, from
Mm,
parishioners, to friends, to my family. Family's complicated. There are ways I wanted my parents to show up for me, and my mom had actually died at that point. She died a few years previous, and they did in amazing ways, but other way, our parents have their own limitations, and so, like,
sure.
how do I forgive them for what they couldn't do? So just kind of working through all the layers of, um, surrendering my strength, surrendering the idea that I could, like, muscle and hustle my way through everything,
Mm,
confronting my mortality. Like, it's
mm,
not that God's gonna keep me alive. Like, I don't think God decided I should live and, like, someone else's 4-year-old with leukemia should die. It definitely doesn't work
yeah.
that way.
Yeah.
Um, so there's a poignant moment where I'm like, "But God, I just wanna live to see my kids grow," and God's like, "They'll be okay if you don't." And I was like, "Wrong answer." So
Right.
so, like, all working through all that stuff. The other thing the other thing, that I worked through, sort of toxic theology or bright siding, was, a dear friend of mine who is more kind of new agey in her theology,
Mhm,
said early on, well, whatever, it was right before it was a tumor. It took
mm,
them a long time to figure out what it was because of its odd presentation. She said, whatever this is, its real name is love. And I was
mm.
like, nope, it is not. Like, I really started wanting to, like, do, positive affirmations and
Yeah.
befriending this, whatever, like, what does it have to teach me? And Instead, I really found this kind of fire in the belly and this, I like to think of myself as a nonviolent person, but truth be told, like I have a lot of ferocity in me and I needed
Mhm,
to access that
mm,
for this particular fight. And I know fighting language does not work for all
mhm.
people living with cancer, or who have survived. And you got to find what works for you. But I needed to kind of find that fire, to carry on.
Yeah. The thing you said earlier about how God will never give us more than we can handle. That's one that I've thought a lot about that because that was even when I was a pastor. Like that was one of the I don't know, you have these like phrases you go to when you're a pastor, right? Because I mean, everybody's always coming to you with their problems and all their different things. And you just have the different things that you say. And that was one of the things I always said was, God will never give us more than we can handle. But then when I started like deconstructing and asking questions, like this is one of the things I was exploring was there's even like so many stories in the Bible where, like for instance, Moses, right? Moses had to keep his arms up in the air, but he couldn't do it on his own. So they had to come aside him and hold his arms up for him. And then there's that one place where I think it was his father-in-law kind of pulled him aside and said, like, you're killing yourself with all the work you're doing. Like,
Yeah,
you need to
good old
divide up.
Jethro.
Yeah, you got to divide up the
Yeah,
labor. You got to give some things to different people. Like, you
the
can't do it all.
judges.
Like, all this
Yeah,
different stuff has come upon your plate and you can't carry it all by yourself. So you need other people. Like, so God certainly lets things come your way that you can handle for the very purpose of you have to build relationships with other people in order
right.
to have other people help you and come alongside of you.
I mean, God, I always tell people when they're like, I'm sorry to be so needy. I'm like, God made you that way.
That's right.
God made us to be interdependent, and it's how the magic happens.
Yeah.
And, that phrase, God doesn't give you more than you can handle, has two false assumptions in it. One is that God's doing the giving. Like, this
Hmm.
didn't come from God. Like, a lot of the stuff that happens in this life does not come from God. I mean, I guess if you say, well, God's the creator and creation was set up so that sometimes cells misdivide and
Hmm.
become cancer, or that, you know, um, whatever, all the horrible things, that tsunamis and earthquake, that the tectonic plates shift and like hundreds of thousands of people die.
Yeah.
You can blame God for that. And yeah, you can. But like
Right.
God didn't, in like every present moment, like God doesn't wake up and make the first cup of coffee and say, okay, who am I going to give cancer to today? Or who am I going to
Right.
burden with all these
Yeah.
things today? So
Yeah.
maybe God gives him like the general, since the beginning of time, sense, this messy gift of creation. But God doesn't like give us as individuals. And more than we can handle, we get more than we can handle all the time. It's
Hmm.
why people die by suicide,
Yeah.
because it's too much. It's
Yeah.
why people turn to substances. 80% of people who are addicts have a trauma history, like
Yeah.
unresolved trauma. So we get more than we can handle all the time.
That's right.
But, what I try to hit is like, are you curious to find out what happens next? Can you look for like that little chink of light? Can you reach for in the like you can't see the light? Can you reach in the darkness for one person who may be there to help you take a step forward, like
Yeah.
help you find your feet? Like there's just look for that space and that you can move into.
Yeah. That's so good. So let's segue into, because this is a good segue into the problem of evil. That's a big
Oh, yeah,
question. That's a
everybody's
light
favorite.
topic. Easy, easy peasy.
I think we're gonna figure it out today, Glenn.
Yeah.
I
So I'm
think
going to
we're
lean
gonna
on
put it to
you.
bed once and for
Yeah. The
all.
progressive Christian pastor is going to answer all of my questions about the problem of evil. But really, like, what have you, how has your thoughts about that evolved over time? Like, where,
Yeah,
maybe like 15, 20 years ago, like where were you? You had all these experiences that you've had in your life, and as a pastor, all other people's experiences as well, to like where you are now. What does that arc look
yeah,
like kind of in your evolution of that idea? Because a lot of people email me a lot and ask me these kinds of questions about the problem of evil. And I point them to different books that I found helpful, but I always like to ask people in your position who are shepherding people and you're dealing with people who are having a lot of crisis, stuff like that in their life, like how has that informed your idea of the problem of evil and why bad things happen in the world when we
yeah,
supposedly serve this loving, powerful God?
right. Okay. I'll try to be concise, but I'm probably
Yeah.
not gonna be. And I'll try to be satisfying, but I know I will definitely not be, because a lot of parts of this answer are not satisfying. It's like there's, first of all, we're all good and bad all mixed together. That doesn't mean we're all like evil and
Mhm,
good. We just have competing, conflicting impulses, longings, desires. Again, aforementioned unhealed trauma.
mhm,
Um, we are all located within certain social groups, and where I think evil comes into play is in the aggregate, right? It's like
mhm,
I think it's hard, maybe impossible. Like I think 20 years ago I would have said like Hitler's evil, or like if I'd known Donald Trump's evil. They're not evil in themselves. They were enabled. Like there's a whole cohort of people there,
yep,
um World War II, who enabled evil,
mhm,
right? It's not located in one person. And if we ever locate evil in one person, then we can scapegoat and murder that person and
mhm,
say, there, evil solved,
yep,
which it, evil is betwixt and between us. It's like always afoot, and it's there. It's enabled by how we respond in any given moment, by
mhm,
whether we resist what we know to be wrong and unjust, or take the easy route, or take the like passively by going along with it, or not speaking up, or actively enable it by participating it and
mhm,
ratcheting it up. Um so the problem of evil, I mean, God invented this world, and invented it with like lots of natural disasters baked into it, and then also gave us free will, which has created all kinds of unnatural disasters.
mhm,
And that's again where the free will comes in. And a concept I really love that I've learned from Rabbi Edwin Friedman and family systems theory is, excuse me, tzimtzum, which is related to the Jewish word, the Hebrew word for raisin, where God shrinks God's self up to make room for our agency,
mhm,
which um, has, let a lot of bad behavior into the room, and also a lot of good behavior, because we are all continually becoming. And this is the other thing I've learned over the last 20 years. There are people who, at a distance, I would want to judge or hate, or just like say, yeah, they're beyond redemption. And yet I've seen people change
mhm,
like so utterly, for, some for good reasons, because of influences on them, external, internal, like they had a mystical experience and met with God. Others for no good reason that I can discern.
mhm,
So it's let me know that God's really not done with any of us yet. And the more we can call people in, like I get just as mad as any progressive about, you know, American politics, and how I hear Christians on the right talking about Jesus, or talking about anyone, who I love. Um, and I know fundamentally, like my job, especially as a white, straight, cis, middle-aged lady, is to call them in and try to speak to their heart, call them out of what I believe is a death cult, and
yeah,
not judge, scapegoat, not be the evil I deplore
yeah.
by othering.
Yeah, I think that's so important because it's about inviting everybody to the table, and we can talk in a minute. I want to ask you about mysticism and being a mystic and that kind of stuff. But it's kind of like the world I'm exploring now is just this idea that, like you said, everybody's welcome. There is no other. There is no. Well, as soon as
Right?
we make an
Everybody's
other,
in.
yeah, as soon as we
Hmm.
make an other, then we start pointing fingers. That just
Yeah.
causes barriers and wars and fights. And my friend Alexander Shaya talks about how everybody's welcome to the table. The only person who's not welcome is the person who thinks that they're right and everybody else is wrong. And they're
Yeah.
welcome, but they can come back later. They have to maybe just take a stand over there in the corner for a little bit, but then they can come back because at the
Yes.
table we want everybody to feel like their opinions matter, that they're valued, they're important, and that we can kind of go together arm in arm, even if we don't see each other eye to eye.
That's right. I want to shout out my friend Rabbi Danya Rettenberg's new book on repentance and repair.
Hmm.
She unpacks Maimonides' ancient, well, it's not ancient, but Middle Ages way of making amends when you've
Hmm.
done harm, and it's just a really beautiful book at a interpersonal, and onto global scale.
I've heard of that book. Now you've piqued my interest. I've heard
Yes,
I was
it's
gonna that was
really
what is
amazing
on my
book.
list of things to read in 2023, so now I'll definitely have to move it to the top of the list.
Good. It's
So one
worth
of the
it.
things, yeah, so when it comes to the problem of evil, like I was thinking while I was reading your book, I was thinking about how my own thoughts about this have evolved over time. And I remember it was like I remember when was it? Maybe it was like 6 years ago, maybe it was 5 years ago. There was a big hurricane that was coming up the East Coast. And I have friends who live from my evangelical days who live like right along the coast. And the hurricane took like this last minute right hook, and then it kind of missed a whole bunch of people, but then slammed back into the coast. And my friends who it missed, like all the posts were going up on how God moved with the storm, and God just took his hand and picked it up and moved it. And I was like, well, wait a minute. Like
Nope.
that makes sense for you, but what about the people who it hit? Like
I
what in the world
know.
did they do? Like why
They
is it
didn't
that
think that through.
yeah,
They
like
didn't think
why is
that
it that
post through.
yeah, and
Yeah.
they're like, well,
Yeah.
God has his reasons because God is sovereign and one day we'll understand. I'm like, no, I don't think that's a good answer. Like, I don't know what the answer is, but I feel like that's not the answer.
It's very convenient. It's convenient when the victors say that, right?
Yes,
It's
yeah,
like, God saved me. So, it's so, I'm sorry, like, this is rude because it's your friends, but that's a really immature way of thinking.
yeah,
Like we're the good guys because we got to live.
that's right.
No, uh-uh.
Yeah, it doesn't work that way. But then another layer of that was when my wife and I had I've told this on the podcast before, but my wife and I had a miscarriage before we had our daughter. And it was like really my first like ever experience with like significant loss like that. And like all these emotions just came like flooding in from nowhere. And up until that time, like I had been a pastor and things like that, and I had helped people with this sort of thing. And like again, the road answers were always, God has his purposes, and you'll see the person again someday, or you see the baby again someday, all these different things. And but when it happened to me, like all of a sudden, like none of those answers did anything for me.
Yeah,
And I remember I went out to my car at the hospital to get it to bring it around to pick up my wife. I was like yelling at God. I was like, this is ridiculous. Like, how
excellent.
in the world can you allow this to happen? Like, you call yourself a loving, good God. Like, where were you? I hit all the right buttons on the vending machine. I go to church. I pastor to church for crying out loud. I read my Bible. I do all these different things. What in the world is going on? I remember
Yeah,
just being confronted with this, like this. You could talk about like a ferociousness of like I have to go after this because like I've studied this stuff all of my life. Like I have all of the right answers in here, but none of them are working in this circumstance. That was really
yeah,
one of the like first steps to my own deconstruction of just taking everything apart. And I kind of came to this conclusion. I've talked to a lot of people kind of along the way, but like I look back on that circumstance and I feel like the sense I get is that God has said like there's nothing I could have done to
yeah,
prevent that from happening to you
yeah.
because this is life and this is the way the universe is set up. I've given it free will to operate as it will. There's certain things I can do, there's certain things I
Yep,
can't do, but what I can
yep,
do is I can make sure you're never alone in the midst of that pain. And so now when I look
yes.
back on that time, like I don't see anymore, this all powerful God kind of in the corner with his arms crossed,
Mhm.
thinking, well, I guess I'm not going to save your baby. I'll save the person in the next room. But instead I see a God who's there with his arms around me and my
Yes,
wife walking us through that grief. And I think that
yeah,
that's for me, like, it's not like you want to have a God who can snap his fingers and make it all better. But at the same time, you don't because there's a lot of times it's not better. And that leaves you with a whole lot of questions of, well, why? Like,
right,
why me? So that's kind of
right.
where I'm at with all this stuff with the problem of evil.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, to say that, like, God says, I couldn't change it, but I will never leave you. And I'm
Yeah.
right there with you in your pain. Like sitting here making a podcast, it sounds a little like, whatever. I don't want to say trite, but it's like, well, that's not satisfying, but it is satisfying in the moment.
That's
It
right.
is satisfying when you're in deep pain and you have an imminent experience of that God
Yeah.
who will not abandon you, or you get like just the right ER nurse who says just the right thing, like
That's right.
all the sort of human angels, God with skin on, I call them,
Hmm.
that God sends to mitigate our suffering in that moment or just
Right.
help us get through it.
That's right.
And even in the ferocity, right?
Yeah.
It's like God's heard it all before. Like Job is a great, like, Job's a great, not cautionary tale, whatever the opposite is. It's like, yeah, God's heard it all before. God can handle our rage and pain and blame.
Yeah. God can
And
handle
that's a
your
necessary
questions.
step.
Yeah,
Yep.
absolutely.
That's a
Absolutely.
necessary step in grief, in a deep grief like that
Yeah, yeah.
for
So
many of
what
us.
so what does prayer look like for you then? Maybe I'll end with this question because again, that's a lot of things that people ask me a lot about is like now that I'm deconstructing, I'm rethinking my faith and I'm wondering if God is all powerful. Like if he's not, what's the point of me praying for different things to happen if
Yeah.
God isn't able to or isn't going to, whatever the case may be, kind of step in to make it better. So I'm wondering, like, as you've had all these experiences in your life, especially like with the cancer and things like that, and people coming to you with their own grief, like, what does prayer
Mhm.
look like for you
Yeah.
these days? Is it a regular thing? Is it kind of like a passing thing throughout the day? Like, what does it look like in your everyday life to pray?
There's the prayers for good times and the prayers for hard times, right?
Mhm.
And the sort
The
of
good
like,
time prayers and the
yeah,
bad
it
time
was
prayers.
the bad type prayer. Like an every day, it was sort of an everyday day today. Like it was, or it was a great day, but I'll often do the Ignatian Examen.
Hmm.
I'm like the hardest working lazy person you'll ever meet. So I'd like to
I
do it
love
in
it.
bed,
Yeah.
lying down. And the Ignatian Examen is just a spiritual review of the day, like you with God looking over your shoulder.
Hmm.
What happened today? And first gratitude. So you like thank God for all the gifts of that day, having dessert first. And then you find out where your like spirit or your brain gets snagged on, a place you messed up or an encounter that didn't go quite right, and you ask God to kind of illuminate that and give
Hmm.
you, teach you something from that. And then finally you think about tomorrow and what you have on your plate and ask God to be present with you in it. So that's like sort of my everyday prayer. And then there's intercessory prayer, praying for other people, which mostly takes the form of like it's more somatic than it used to be. Like
Hmm.
I definitely pray out loud with people or send people prayer texts, but lighting a candle when
Hmm.
someone's in labor or someone's dying or someone's making a decision, and just breathing, just pausing throughout my day and breathing in what they're holding, breathing out, God's presence for them.
Hmm.
And then there's the like really hard days prayers. And I wrote a chapter about prayer and how to begin. And it's one of my kind of newer metaphors for prayer is that God is a spotter. We're rock climbing and God is below on the belay line, you know, and it's not that like we're harnessed, so we're not going to plummet to our death, but we're also stuck. Like if,
Hmm.
we're stuck in the middle of the rock face and we don't know where the next handhold is, and all of our muscles are shaking, and we're trying to use these tiny little puny muscles like our biceps and triceps, which are, ego or hustle to get through. And
Yeah.
God wants us to use the big muscles, like the glutes and quads to push ourselves up. And God is down below shouting where the next handhold is.
Mm.
So God's not just going to like lift us to the top, because where's the like life in that. We have to do something under our own efforts, but God will guide us. Like just look up to your left at 2 o'clock and you'll see, well, that doesn't look like anything. God, trust me, it is. Reach
Mm.
for that thing. Look, put your, God's there, um as lure, as guide, to show us what the next place we can put ourselves in to be secure,
Yeah.
or if
Yeah.
not secure, but to move out of the stuck place we're in. Let's say that.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like a lot of your prayer is kind of organized around that idea of God's presence as
Yeah,
opposed to God's power. Would I be correct in saying that? Like it's more about
absolutely.
God
Yeah,
being with us, be with let the person who's hurting maybe sense your presence, like that kind of thing, as opposed
yeah.
to God flex your muscles and overcome this thing.
And there's a little bit more in the presence, because presence, I don't think it's passive, but it can feel very passive.
Yeah,
Like we're
yeah,
just going to sit here in this muck. And sometimes that's what you got to do. Like
yeah,
there's only one way through grief. You got to grieve, right? And
yeah,
it feels like hell.
yeah.
Um, but I've learned a lot from process theology, which is God as a lure.
Hmm.
Like God can't make us do things, but if we get really quiet, we can sense a direction in which God is calling us.
That's
You
right.
know, there's lots of things that claim us and people who make claims over us. And um and if we can just get quiet enough to feel which way God is luring us, God is always luring us toward good and toward freedom.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Last question. Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Something else just came to my mind. Okay.
Okay.
You mentioned Richard Rohr. You just mentioned process theology. So I think a good ending place is, what are some of the resources or some of the thinkers, the teachers who have most influenced kind of you and your journey?
Oh gosh, I have the worst recall, but I will say, for sure, I've mentioned Rabbi Edwin Friedman and
Yep.
family systems theory, and the Lombard Mennonite Peace Center has really helped me do a lot of like personal healing work,
Okay.
which has allowed me to be a better pastor and person in my family and friend. Um, Richard Rohr for
Hmm.
sure. C.S. Lewis, I know he's like not cool among a lot of progressives because he's
Mixed
kind of,
feelings.
yeah,
Yeah.
low key misogyny, but I was raised on his stuff and I
Yep, me
still love
too.
Mere Christianity so much. Um, God, I don't want to like, do I want to do too many or too few? I gotta look at my thing.
Go to the
Um,
bookshelf, right?
exactly. Joan Chittister. I love Joan Chittister.
Mm,
Um, Glennon Doyle has been a really huge influence. Brene Brown, you know, the
yep,
sort of like all the sort of people in the vanguard of the movement toward vulnerability as a strength.
yep.
Um, I'll leave it there. There's
Have
like
you have you heard
two
of
thousand more. At the back of
yeah,
my book, there's a whole. It's like books are my best
there's a whole
friends,
lot of
and
things.
here are all the books that have shaped me. Yeah,
Have you heard of Thomas Ord?
I don't think so. No.
Thomas Ord wrote a book. He's into like process theology, open relational theology, but he wrote a book called
Mm,
God Can't, and he
mm.
explores the problem of evil. And he talks about that idea that because there's certain things that God can't do, because if
God
God were to
placing
be,
limits on
yeah, if
God's
God
self.
could
Yeah,
do it, that would mean that God would have to overcome free will. And that's the most unloving thing that you could possibly do. And God is love. And so he kind of
yeah,
paints this conundrum, so to speak,
yeah,
and then really takes us into it. And that book helped me a lot process through a lot of those kinds of questions. So
yeah.
add that one to your list.
I will. We each got
Awesome.
some good reading.
That's right. Well, we're just about out of time, but this has been a lot of fun. So thank you for taking the time to
Thanks so
join me.
much.
Yeah, thank you for your
Yeah,
work. And
great to
just
be
thank you.
here. You're welcome.
Absolutely. And real quick, where's the best place for people to go online to find you and your work?
I have a website,
Mhm.
mollybaskette.com. You can see all my books there. You can buy How to Begin wherever you buy books. Ask your library to carry it, ask your local bookseller, or if you get it from Jeff Bezos, please leave a review on Amazon because those really do help people find books they wouldn't otherwise find.
Absolutely. Well, I'll put the links in the show notes and maybe we can do it again because I got more questions.
Great.
Awesome.